You know, after nearly a century on this earth, I've learned a funny little truth. The moment you think money should be easy is the moment it becomes impossible. I've watched bright young men, smarter than me, quicker than me, louder than me, burn through their best years because they thought wealth should arrive like a delivery package. They'd sit there tapping their foot, wondering why the universe hadn't sent them a fortune yet. And I'd think, kid, you don't even have the first brick laid. How the hell are you expecting a castle? Let me tell you something from the old days, back when I was still stumbling around trying to make sense of dollars and cents. I had an uncle, not the wise kind. You read about a man who saved nickels in a jar for 10 years and then spent the whole jar on a car stereo he didn't need. He wasn't poor because he was unlucky. He was poor because every time his money reached a point where it could start growing, he'd kill it. Slice it open like a chicken he hoped would lay a golden egg someday. Believe me, if you do that long enough, life will teach you arithmetic the painful way. Back then, during the tail end of the Depression, I saw what real financial weakness looked like. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand collapse. It was quiet. It was parents pretending they weren't hungry. It was neighbors selling their tools for pennies. It was grown men getting smaller every year because the world had them by the throat. I remember standing outside a boarded-up shop thinking, I don't ever want to be at the mercy of other people's decisions. And that feeling stayed with me long after the dust settled and the economy forgot its own misery. But here's the paradox, the one nobody likes. The first real step toward freedom is also the most unpleasant one. It demands you behave better than your circumstances. It demands you save when saving hurts. It demands you look your own impatience in the eye and tell it to sit down and shut up. That, my friend, is the toll gate. And most people turn around before they reach it. They chase shortcuts because the ground beneath them feels too slow. They think discipline is optional, sacrifice is negotiable, and compounding is some magical trick the lucky people discover by accident. Let me make this very simple. There is no magic. There is only the work you do when nobody claps for you. And if that sounds harsh, good. Harsh kept me alive. Harsh kept food on the table. Harsh built every foundation I ever stood on. You want to know why most people never build wealth? Because they want comfort on day one and results on day two. Well, today I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. Today I'm going to tell you the things nobody wants to hear, but everybody needs to. If you want to know the quickest way to stay broke, I'll tell you. It's not gambling. It's not buying silly stocks you don't understand. It's not even debt, although that one does a fine job of ruining people. No, the fastest road to financial misery is simpler. Start comparing yourself to everyone around you. That's envy. And envy, believe me, is the only sin that doesn't even give you a moment of pleasure. It's like swallowing poison and expecting your neighbor to feel sick. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're building a small fire in a windy field. It's delicate, fragile, still learning to breathe. Then every gust of envy you allow blows straight through it, scattering every spark you've managed to create. That's what comparison does to your savings. Just when your little pile begins to warm up, envy shows up like a careless child kicking sand onto the flame. I once knew a young accountant, bright kid, decent salary, good head on his shoulders. His only problem was he couldn't stand that his college roommate drove a nicer car, so he upgraded. Then the roommate took a trip to Europe, so he booked a bigger one. Then the roommate bought a condo, and that's when he finally crossed the finish line, not of wealth, but of debt. He wasn't building a life, he was reenacting someone else's. And the tragic part, he didn't even like the guy. That's how envy works. It tricks you into chasing trophies you don't want, with money you don't have, on a timeline you can't sustain. It's financial cosplay, and the price of the costume is your future. Here's the paradox that drives people insane. The moment you try to look rich is the moment you guarantee you won't become rich. Wealth is built quietly. Consumption is loud. Real wealth whispers behind closed doors. Envy screams through the showroom window. It's no contest. The quiet path wins every time. And let me ask you something. What exactly do you gain when you envy someone? Do you get their bank account, their peace of mind, their years of saving and sacrifice? Of course not. You just get an expensive urge to ruin your own progress. Envy is a thief. It steals discipline first, money second, dignity third. I learned this early. In my 30s, I watched men twice my age implode because they couldn't stand seeing someone else move ahead. They took risks that weren't theirs to take, gambled with money they didn't truly own, and puffed their chests until the breeze of a recession knocked them flat. Meanwhile, the dull, boring men, the ones who didn't bother measuring their lives with someone else's yardstick, quietly built fortunes. That's the lesson. The person who ignores envy saves more. The person who saves more reaches the first $100,000 sooner. And the one who reaches that milestone stops caring what anyone else thinks anyway. So the next time you feel envy creeping in, remember this. You're comparing your early struggle to someone else's middle chapter and sabotaging your future in the process. Envy doesn't just make you miserable, it makes you mathematically poorer. And if that isn't a stupid trade, I don't know what is. Here's the thing most people never understand. Building wealth is a lot like heating a pot of water over a weak flame. For the first 10 minutes, you stare at the pot wondering if the stove is even on. Nothing bubbles, nothing moves, nothing rewards you. But the moment it reaches the boiling point, everything changes at once. The transformation looks sudden, but the suffering was slow. That's discipline. That's compounding. And that's why the early phase feels like punishment rather than progress. When I was in my 20s, scraping together money from a modest lawyer's paycheck, I used to joke that my savings grew slower than my shoelaces wore out. I'd stash away a bit, invest a bit, then sit there feeling like I'd built the world's smallest museum exhibit. One year I remember making a measly few dollars in returns, literally the price of a cheap lunch, and thinking, is this the great secret to wealth everyone whispers about? It felt like I was paying rent to disappointment. But here's the paradox I wish someone had pounded into my skull earlier. Discipline feels pointless, right up until the moment it becomes unstoppable. You don't get a warning, you don't get applause, you don't even get a hint. You grind, you wait, you endure boredom, and then one day the numbers tilt in your favor, and you wonder why the whole world didn't tell you this sooner. Well, they did. You just didn't want to believe them. Let me give you a short story, entirely ordinary, entirely human. I once knew a young engineer who saved diligently for 2 years. Then he quit because his portfolio wasn't doing anything. He took that money and bought a nicer car, the kind that announces insecurity before the engine starts. 5 years later, the car was gone, the money was gone, and he was right back where he started, except older and a little more bitter. That's the tax impatience charges you. You pay in time you cannot get back. Meanwhile, the dull person who kept saving the same boring amount, no drama, no flair, quietly doubled his money. Not through brilliance, but through endurance. That's the irony. The race is won not by the fastest sprinter, but by the slowest quitter. Compounding doesn't reward the clever. It rewards the stubborn. Ask yourself a simple question. Why does discipline feel so hard at the beginning? Because the results are invisible. And why does it feel effortless later? Because the results become inevitable. That's the bend in the road where compounding stops whispering and starts shouting. But you only hear that shout if you survive the silence. The truth is painful. The beginning is supposed to feel like failure. The middle is supposed to feel uncertain. But the end feels like gravity pulling you forward. And once you reach that stage, you'll look back at the early years and laugh, wondering why you ever doubted something so obvious. But here's the warning. You can't skip the boring part. You can't microwave consistency. You can't cheat time. The fire needs hours before the water boils. The only question is whether you have the temperament to stand there, holding the pot, while everyone else walks away. Let me tell you something that sounds ridiculous until you're old enough to appreciate it. Most people don't lose money because they're unlucky. They lose it because they can't sit still. They treat investing like a carnival ride, up, down, jump off, jump on, and then wonder why they're nauseous and broke. The truth is, the real money, the durable money, comes from sitting longer than your discomfort. Think of compounding like planting a fruit tree. You put the seed in the ground, water it, wait, and then if you're an idiot, you dig it up every month to check whether the roots are growing fast enough. That's what most investors do. They dig up their own tree. Then they complain the orchard never materializes. Well, of course it doesn't. You never gave anything enough time to live. When I was in my 30s, I bought a tiny stake in a dull little company, nothing fancy, nothing heroic. I held it for a while, watched it go nowhere, and eventually convinced myself I could use the cash more efficiently. So I sold it. A few years later, that boring little business became a monster. I could have funded half my future with it. Instead, I bought myself a very valuable lesson. Impatience is expensive, and usually far more costly than any market downturn. But most people don't learn. The moment their investment ticks down a few percent, they panic. They start performing emotional gymnastics, convincing themselves they see danger or want to lock in gains. Believe me, the brain is a masterful liar when it wants dopamine or relief. And the market is more than happy to punish those impulses. The more you act, the more you pay. Activity feeds the brokers, not you. Here's the paradox. In almost every area of life, action is rewarded. Work harder, get promoted. Train harder, get stronger. Study harder, get smarter. But in investing, effort is often the enemy. The guy who checks his portfolio 10 times a day usually performs worse than the guy who forgets he even has one. The market does not pay you for motion. It pays you for endurance. Let me ask you a simple question. When you buy a great business, a genuinely great business, why would you sell it just because the price twitched? Does the factory shut down? Do the customers vanish? Does the company forget how to make money? Of course not. 9 times out of 10, the only thing that changed was your mood. And if your financial future depends on your mood, you're doomed. Sitting still requires humility. It requires admitting that you don't know when the next dip is coming, when the next rally arrives, or which direction the wind will blow this week. But that humility, that willingness to look boring, to feel foolish, to resist the itch, is exactly what allows compounding to do its job. The world is full of hyperactive amateurs sprinting in circles. Don't join them. Let them tire themselves out. Sit, wait, hold your tree, and when the fruit finally arrives, they'll call you lucky. But you'll know the truth. You weren't lucky. You were quiet. And that's something most people never master. Here's a truth people don't like hearing because it pokes straight through their pride. Most folks spend their entire lives behaving like rented machinery. They trade their hours, they follow orders, they collect a paycheck, and then they wonder why their net worth looks like a flat line drawn by a tired accountant. You don't build wealth by renting yourself out. You build it by owning something, anything that works, even while you sleep. Let me give you an image. Picture 2 men on the same river. One rows a little wooden boat with his bare hands. He rows harder, his arms ache, he sweats, he curses the current, but he barely moves. The other man, he owns a rusty old motor. Not glamorous, not powerful, but it pushes the boat forward whether he's rowing or napping. The first man is an employee. The second is an owner. And over a lifetime, the difference isn't 2 miles, it's an ocean. When I was a young lawyer, I met plenty of brilliant people who worked themselves half to death. They billed hours like they were manufacturing them in the basement. One fellow in particular, a meticulous, disciplined guy, kept chasing promotions as if they were lottery tickets. 20 years later, he had a corner office, a fancy title, and almost no money. Why? Because he spent his whole life selling slices of his time instead of building anything that belonged to him. A resume full of gold stars and a bank account full of dust. Contrast that with another acquaintance, a quiet, unremarkable type who bought a small stake in a family business. The business didn't look special. It sold plumbing supplies, for heaven's sake. No glamour, no headlines. But year after year, that ownership stake kicked out cash. While the careerist was still impressing his bosses, the boring guy was slowly becoming wealthy. Not because he was smarter, but because he understood leverage, the kind that doesn't come from banks, but from owning productive assets. Here's the paradox most people never grasp. Security from a job feels safe, but creates dependence. Ownership feels risky, yet creates independence. And independence is the only true wealth. A paycheck stops when someone else decides it should. An asset keeps paying as long as the world still needs what it produces. Ask yourself a simple question. Are you building anything that will outlive your labor? Or are you just polishing your LinkedIn profile hoping someone tosses you a better title? That's not ambition. That's captivity dressed up as achievement. Look, I'm not telling you to quit your job and start a circus. I'm telling you to shift your mindset from how do I earn more per hour to what can I own that earns even when I don't? A share of a business, a small piece of real estate, a chunk of a company that sells toothpaste or hamburgers or insurance. Something dull enough to survive, simple enough to understand, and patient enough to compound. The first $100,000 demands this mental shift more than any other milestone. An employee mindset says, if I just work harder, I'll get ahead. An owner mindset says, if I accumulate assets, I won't have to work harder forever. And that's the difference between a life of rowing and a life of steering. Because in the end, the people who treat money like wages end up chasing it for decades. The people who treat money like seeds end up with orchards. And orchards, unlike bosses, don't care how many hours you work this week. They just keep growing. I grew up in an era where money didn't just disappear, it evaporated like morning mist. One day it was there, the next day the bank had chained its doors shut and your savings were a polite fiction. And although the world looks shinier today, the underlying truth hasn't changed one damn bit. Fragility is timeless. Human foolishness is timeless. And the lessons from those hard years still apply, whether you're trading on a smartphone or shoveling coal like my neighbors once did. Let me give you an image. Imagine a long street during the Depression, houses lined up like tired soldiers. Some houses had families who scraped and saved every nickel. Others had families who borrowed from every friendly face in town. When the storm hit, the savers bent but didn't break. The borrowers collapsed like cardboard in the rain. That was the neighborhood lesson. Survival belongs to the cautious, not the clever. And that little truth never went out of style. I remember a shopkeeper down the block, hardworking, honest, but addicted to optimism. Every time business slowed, he'd say, "Things will pick up tomorrow," and take on more credit. Then one winter, tomorrow never arrived. His store went dark, his suppliers demanded payment, and the man's entire life flipped upside down in a week. That's what happens when your future depends on everything going right. The world rarely cooperates. Here's the paradox people refuse to accept. If you prepare for bad times, you get to enjoy the good times. But if you assume good times will last forever, the bad times wipe you out. It's that simple. In my experience, pessimism protects your downside, and optimism grows your upside. The trouble is most folks pick one and ignore the other. They gamble in booms like they're bulletproof, and then panic in busts like they never saw a storm before. Ask yourself this: if another shock hit tomorrow, a recession, a layoff, a health crisis, would you still be standing? Or would you be scrambling, bargaining with reality, wishing you'd lived more carefully? because resilience isn't built during disaster. It's built long before it. The Depression taught me a rule I've followed for 90 plus years. Build a margin of safety into everything you can. Your finances, your plans, your expectations. Live a little below your means. Hold some cash even when cash feels stupid. Don't tie your fate to borrowed money or borrowed confidence. And for heaven's sake, assume the world isn't obligated to be kind to you. People think this mindset is outdated, that modern times are different. Believe me, they're not. The costumes change. The danger doesn't. The world still rewards the people who stay liquid, stay rational, and stay humble long enough to let opportunity come back around. Because here's the quiet truth no one likes admitting. Every generation gets its own version of the Depression. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not as visible, but the pattern repeats. Those who learned caution survive it. Those who didn't get a very expensive education. And that's why the lessons from my childhood still matter today. Not because history repeats exactly, but because human behavior repeats perfectly. And if you ignore that, well, history will be happy to introduce itself to you the hard way. If you want to know what really sinks people financially, it's not usually some grand catastrophe. It's the small, quiet poisons they let drip into their lives day after day. Debt, drama, and dumb people. 3 little leaks in the bottom of your boat. And it doesn't matter how hard you row, those leaks will sink you long before you reach any shore worth landing on. Let me start with debt, the friendliest looking poison. It approaches with a smile. Take the loan, it whispers. You deserve this. Then one day you wake up and realize the thing you bought owns you, not the other way around. When I was young, I watched a cousin of mine borrow for everything, furniture, gadgets, even a vacation he barely enjoyed. Each month he'd swear he was almost caught up. He never caught up. Debt didn't kill him quickly, it just tightened the rope a little each year until every decision he made was a hostage negotiation. That's what people forget. Debt doesn't ruin your wallet first. It ruins your freedom. Then there's drama. And believe me, nothing compounds faster than chaos. I've seen entire fortunes evaporate because someone couldn't resist picking fights, suing neighbors, or jumping into toxic relationships. You can spot dramatic people by how loudly they talk and how quietly their bank accounts grow. They live like life is a soap opera, and soap operas don't leave room for compounding. Money hates noise. It prefers silence, stability, and long stretches of nothing happening. Drama is the opposite, a fire that demands constant fuel, and eventually, the fuel ends up being you. And finally, dumb people, the most underestimated risk of all. I don't mean people with low IQs. I mean people who refuse to learn, who repeat mistakes like they're reciting a favorite poem, who drag chaos behind them like a parade float. If you tie your life to them as a friend, as a partner, as an investor, you inherit their stupidity. And stupidity has a catastrophic way of showing up at the worst possible moment. I once knew a businessman who partnered with an unreliable fellow because he seemed fun. Fun cost him hundreds of thousands and a decade of regret. You can survive a bad market. You can survive bad luck. Surviving a bad partner is harder. Here's the paradox people never notice. You don't need brilliance to reach the first $100,000. You just need to stop bleeding from the little cuts. Avoid debt, and suddenly you have cash to invest. Avoid drama, and suddenly you have the calm necessary to stay disciplined. Avoid dumb people, and suddenly stupidity stops ambushing your plans. Remove these poisons, and wealth becomes less of an uphill battle and more of a long walk. Ask yourself a simple question. Is your life accumulating or leaking? Because compounding isn't just a financial process, it's an environmental one. Your surroundings either push you forward or pull you under. And the people who reach that first $100,000 aren't always the smartest. They're just the ones who remember to plug the holes before they set sail. The truth is, if you avoid the 3 poisons long enough, your money will quietly start working. If you don't, You'll spend a lifetime rowing a boat that never moves. And it won't be because you lacked effort. It'll be because you ignored the leaks. If there's one idea I hope you carry with you long after this conversation ends, it's this. The first $100,000 isn't really about money. It's about transformation. It's about becoming the sort of person who can endure boredom, resist impulse, ignore envy, sit still when the world shakes, and build a life on principles instead of cravings. That's the real milestone. The dollars are just the scoreboard. Everything gets easier after that first hill, because the hardest part isn't compounding. It's becoming the kind of human being compounding can trust. Once you cross that threshold, the game feels different. You stop panicking at small dips. You stop chasing every shiny opportunity. You start valuing the quiet, patient path over the noisy, frantic one. In short, you finally behave like someone who has something to lose and even more to gain. Let me leave you with a few reminders, woven together the way an old man tells stories by a warm fire. First, spend less than you earn, not once, not occasionally, but as a way of being. Second, invest simply and consistently, even when the numbers look unimpressive, especially when they look unimpressive. Third, avoid the nonsense that derails most people. Comparison, chaos, bad partners, and cheap temptations disguised as happiness. Those things devour futures long before the market ever gets a chance. Ask yourself the uncomfortable question. Am I helping compounding, or am I interrupting it? Because compounding is a loyal ally, but only if you stop sabotaging it. Give it enough time, enough patience, and enough restraint, and it will carry you further than you expect. Give it drama, debt, or envy, and it will leave you exactly where it found you. You know, people often assume I planned everything, the wealth, the investments, the so-called wisdom. But the truth is embarrassingly simple. I didn't plan to win. I just refused to lose in the obvious ways. I avoided the traps that swallowed everyone else. I kept my life quiet, my habits simple, and my expectations realistic. And over time, those tiny decisions compounded into something people now call success, as if it were intentional brilliance. It wasn't. It was stubborn survival. So here's my parting punchline, and you can carve it in stone if you like. I never set out to become rich. I just avoided being stupid long enough. Do that, and the first $100,000 will come. Do it longer, and everything after that becomes almost inevitable.